We have a great movie review for you, as we usually do on Fridays. John Kim is here from Rethink Reviews. And what's the movie we're reviewing today, John?
A Crude Awakening.
A Crude Awakening. Interesting. So let's watch and listen to the review first, and then we'll come back and give you some very interesting facts about peak oil.
In America, we right now think that people are having their eyes gouged out, paying $3.20 for a gallon of gasoline. That's 20 cents a cup. And 20 cents a cup sounds pretty trivial, but if you have a passenger car, average American passenger car, you can get 1 to 6 people in it, throw a bunch of stuff in the luggage, in the trunk, go 1.5 miles in 20 minutes for 20 cents. Now, if you don't have gasoline and you try to bargain with a guy with a horse-drawn cart or someone coming by with a bicycle, or maybe you're lucky enough to have a rickshaw, said, "Excuse me, would any of you like to take me 1.5 miles, me and my friends, 1.5 miles for 20 cents? Those people would laugh at you. So I would think that we would need to get oil prices up to, $5 a cup, some number that starts to equate with what we actually spend readily on a lot of things that aren't nearly as valuable and also aren't non-renewable.
One thing you'll definitely take away from the powerful documentary A Crude Awakening is that oil is truly an amazing substance, the product of organic material and solar energy compressed, concentrated, and cooked over millions of years. Our ability to use oil has fueled mankind's population boom and allowed us to conquer the world and even a few parts of space. Everything in our lives is dependent on oil, from the food we eat to the manufacturing and transportation of every single product we use. Oil is mankind's lifeblood, and what A Crude Awakening will tell you quite convincingly is that we're very close to running out of it, something that mankind is clearly unprepared for, at which point we'll more than likely be completely screwed. Need convincing? Then I think I have the movie for you. A Crude Awakening provides a vital perspective that I'd never really thought of, that virtually every aspect of modern civilization and progress has come from oil. It enables science, transportation, war, commerce, technology, food production, packaging, manufacturing. If it's in your life, chances are it's made of, with, or brought to you by oil. And for the longest time, those of us in the industrialized nations have acted as if we'd never run out. The US used to be the world's #1 oil producer until as recently as the 1950s, essentially the Saudi Arabia of its day, and we acted like those Texas wells would never stop pumping, just as we're currently pretending that Saudi Arabian oil will always be there. Little hint for you, it won't. As experts in the film point out, our methods of both finding and extracting oil are already highly advanced, meaning that we've become very good at locating oil and getting it out of the ground fast. There simply aren't any big untapped oil fields left to discover, and even if there are, they won't make a dent in global demand, especially with so many countries trying to emulate the West's oil-fueled prosperity, including giants like China and India who've only recently begun using oil in large amounts. Yet even as global demand and use of oil has grown, the projected reserves of oil have miraculously remained constant. How could this be? You guessed it, it's a scam. Oil-producing countries have an incentive to lie about their reserves, since the more oil they claim they have, the more they can pump and the more money they can make. Sure, this means that we're using oil at a dangerous and irresponsible rate. But hey, since when have we let long-term realities get in the way of destructive short-term profits? What are you, a socialist or something? A Crude Awakening also deflates some of the myths about where our future energy could come from. Hydrogen? Only if you don't mind waiting 30 to 50 years at the minimum to create the infrastructure and demand. Nuclear? Sure, if you don't mind 10,000 new nuclear plants, the threats to national security, the problem of what to do with the waste, and the fact that the world would probably run out of uranium for the reactors in 10 to 20 years. Tar sands take tons of fuel to extract the oil, wreck the environment in the process, and are the oil equivalent of trying to scrape pot crumbs out of your carpet. It's really not a good way to keep you high. There isn't enough biomass to convert to fuel without raising food prices or using more fuel to grow it. And even wind power is called out as too intermittent and having too low of an energy density to ever be a viable large-scale source of energy. No, the holy grail of energy is the sun, which reliably rains down 20,000 times more energy on our planet than humans currently use, and is ultimately the source of the fossil fuel energy we use now. Unfortunately, we've barely begun to understand how to harness solar energy, and it seems like the world's politicians won't summon the courage to call for a transition to clean energy until we're beyond the crisis stage. But as one of the film's experts points out, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones, and we didn't invent cars because we ran out of hay for our horses. As the people in A Crude Awakening tell us, humans have reached the peak in terms of oil production and use. What we do next will decide if we're going to descend slowly from this peak into the oilless valley, or if we're going to remain oblivious until we step off a very, very tall cliff. I'm Jonathan Kim, and this is a Rethink Review.
So, John, just flesh out what peak oil is a little bit more for the audience. What exactly does it mean, and what are the consequences?
Okay, peak oil. The idea was discovered by a man named M. King Hubbard, who is an American geophysicist, and it's the idea that when you start looking for oil, you're going to start to find a whole bunch, and then eventually you'll find most of what there is that's easy to find, and then it'll kind of drop off. In about 30 or 40 years after that, your oil production is going to ramp up, and it'll basically follow the same bell-shaped curve where you'll be producing a lot of oil, and then you'll reach the peak where you're producing kind of as much as you can, and then that amount will slowly drop off to nothing.
All right. Now, the problem is, like, why peak oil rather than the end of oil? Why is the peak oil the problem rather than, okay, when we run out and we're all screwed?
Because we'll still be able to pump it out a little bit at a time, because we'll find a few new fields every now and then. Maybe some new technology will come online, or it'll take a while for these oil fields to get depleted. It's not like you're going to be pumping at full capacity, and then all of a sudden it just stops. They'll keep kind of digging around and looking for it.
So is that the problem? And one of the problems is that the price of oil starts to get dramatically higher once we feel we've peaked out, because then well, we only have a finite amount left. Hence, supply and demand, and you're going to get much higher prices.
Yeah, that's it. There will be more demand than there is capacity, and so then there will be fights for this oil. Who's going to get it? And with so many countries coming online now who need it now, like giant ones like China and India, who 30 years ago didn't use much oil at all.
Fight for oil. I feel like I've heard of that possibility before. Like people starting a war for oil? No, that couldn't be.
And it may even become like an overt resource war. I mean, here we're like, oh no, Saddam Hussein's the new Hitler or whatever. They had to come up with other reasons. And it's like, no, we're just going to go and get the oil. And people will be like, well, we need it. So.
But John, seriously though, when you look at that, if Cheney agrees with you, and Cheney thinks that, OPEC is full of it, and we actually have a lot less oil than we think we do, right? Then taking Iraq and Iran strategically for America, because Cheney thought Iraq was nonsense. He wanted Iraq and Iran to be able to control that area of oil. If you don't have Iran, well, then Iraq was useless, because then they'd be primarily Shiite and work with Iran, right? So that's why he pushed Bush so hard to get Iran. Mm-hmm. So was he kind of right? I mean, it's kind of a funny way of putting it, but like if you look at it only from that perspective.
If you look at it only where you have a finite amount of a valuable resource, then of course you want to get it. But then we see that there's repercussions of that, like 9/11, like us getting into all these wars, like everyone hating us, like having to have more military in places, which makes everyone hate us even more. And then also when you look at the fact that this finite resource is actually bad for us.
And besides which, the problem that drives me crazy about Cheney, because look, of course, Iraq war is wrong for 100 reasons, okay? But what I'm pointing out here is that it's wrong. Even if you think Cheney was right. Do you see what I'm saying? Because look, even if you get Iraq and Iran, what people fail to recognize is that doesn't mean that that's the U.S. oil. It just means that Exxon gets to sell it,
right? Instead
of another country's company. So why are we fighting the war for Exxon?
It's a good question, and that's part of why why the oil is cheaper for us, because our government subsidizes it by our military presence, by building roads, by giving cheap leases, by things like that. I mean, that's why it's cheaper, because they're not actually paying that money.
Right, which goes to the oil spill. I know you want to connect these two things. So we get a huge oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and the Republicans saying drill baby drill, and that's our oil, and we need to get it out. But BP is getting the oil out. How is it our oil when British Petroleum gets it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when we say, oh, we need more offshore drilling because, our states don't have enough money and whatever, but when you look at around the world, the countries that have the oil, it's not like every one of those countries are rich. Saudi Arabia was like a 50% unemployment level, like places like Nigeria, like these war-torn African countries, like they're not swimming in oil money, like they don't get that stuff.
The only country that's doing really well is Norway. Not the only country, that's not fair, but the country that is known to be doing really well based on oil money is Norway, okay? Mm-hmm. And I talked about this yesterday on the show. Norway has socialized their oil industry.
Right.
So they make sure it's taken out in a really safe way. So they have an excellent safety record on offshore oil drilling, which they do. But they take a lot of precautions. And then they keep the profits for the people of Norway.
Right.
So that's why they're rich. When you look at it that way, you're like, wait a minute, why do we have the system we have? And I know that there are other reasons, and I know it's complicated, but it is an interesting point. Now, you think the oil spill might have something to do with the fact that we don't have as much oil as we think we do. How? Why?
Right, because I mean, the drill that we put in there it's miles down, which is obviously why I think it was a mile below the water and then like 5 miles below the seabed after that. And we're not used to drilling at those depths, and we're obviously not very good at it. And the idea like, oh, well, we can't fix the spill because we can't put divers down there. We're having to do it with submersibles. It's because it's hard to do. The temperatures are higher down there. The pressure is higher down there. And so if there was easier oil to get, we would be getting it. But instead, we're going to like these really difficult lengths, and there's like BP says that there's like billions and billions of gallons of oil in the Gulf of Mexico, which is also where all the hurricanes are. And so we're drilling deeper in ways that we're not really good at in a place where there's a lot of storms, and there's going to be more probably because of climate change. And so we're going to these greater lengths, and like I mentioned in the review, like tar sands, like. You don't go to the tar sands unless you really, really have to. That's not a good way to get oil. And also the oil you get out of there is low grade. It's basically oil that hasn't become oil yet. It hasn't been heated enough and pressured enough to become the oil that we know and like. So to get this oil sands oil, we have to heat it up and like melt it down. The oil that comes out is kind of synthetic. It uses a lot of fresh water to create it. And I believe it releases something like 20% more CO2, more carbon when you burn it.
By the way, another scary thought in there is that, look, this oil spill continues to spill out 200,000 gallons of oil a day. At least, right?
Could be as high as 1 million.
And as John was referring to there, it's possible that there's about 3.5 billion gallons of oil down there. Jesus, I mean, the largest spill ever was 11 million by Exxon Valdez. This can dwarf it if they can't figure out a way to stop it. And now they're saying, well, look, it might take 3 months to stop it.
Right, to drill that side well.
Right. So, I mean, the catastrophic consequences of this is unbelievable. And why are we drilling that deep? It might be because we're desperate, right? Exactly. In some ways. I mean, of course, every company's desperate for profits, right? But if BP had a place where they can get the oil easier and not risk losing $10 billion in damages that they're going to have, right, then they would do it. So how do we know, though, John, and I think this is the critical question, if we have gotten at peak oil? How do we know if the Kuwaitis are lying or the Saudis are lying? And you see what I'm saying?
Right. We don't really know because in the end, OPEC doesn't allow auditors into their countries to actually test it themselves. Oxford did some research, and they feel that maybe the capacity should be downgraded from 1,150 or 1,350 barrels to about 850 to 900 billion barrels. So they think that that's more like what OPEC has. But basically what happened was in the 80s, OPEC went to a system where it was a quota system. So it's like, okay, what are your reserves? And then you can pump out a certain percentage of that. And so what happened overnight, a bunch of these OPEC countries just like doubled and increased what they said their reserves were. In 84, Kuwait went from 47 billion to 92 billion barrels. And I think that was without announcing they'd found any new fields. They're like, oh, actually, our reserves are just bigger. And
I want to pause there and make sure everybody understands that. So if you have more reserves, you can sell more oil. That's the understanding. So instantly, overnight, these guys go, oh, yeah, sure, of course we have more oil. Don't worry, let us sell more oil. So they're going to make more money in the short run. But, John, that leads to point number 2. But aren't they going to get hurt in the long run? So why would they do that?
Well, in the movie, a guy says, well, all the leaders in control, they'll all be dead by the time that happens. They don't care, they're cashing in as quick as they can, and they're going to have that money, and their family's going to have that money, and the country may collapse, but they may not be there when that happens, so.
How do you like them apples? Okay. So all this fun stuff. And by the way, just real quick as we wrap up here, as you pointed out, oil is actually used in making all of our products. It's not just your cars. It's not just transportation. Okay, so that's why people are scared to death of peak oil. I mean, what happens if we start running out? I mean, then we got a Mad Max kind of situation. I know people paint that scene, and I'm sure it's not going to be like that. But how bad could it be?
Yeah, I mean, there's a question of how many people can the Earth sustain without a lot of oil. And I think I read, like, for every 1 calorie of food that we eat, 10 calories of fossil fuels are used to create that food. So even if say like, oh, well, I live in the city, I don't drive that much, or whatever it is, it's like, well, your food needs oil to get made, needs to get to you. Your clothes, just the manufacturing of things just takes oil to make it, and even whether they're made out of a petroleum-based substance or not.
So I'm going to start practicing archery making my own knives. I'm going to go watch Robin Hood.
Yeah, get leather outfits with lots of spikes because I think in Mad Max that's the style in that era. So.
And I'm going to buy, what's that corn seed that they sell on Glenn Beck's show? Like disaster seeds or something? All right, well, that is scary stuff. Let's hope the Kuwaitis and the Saudis aren't lying. Oh boy, we're in a lot of trouble. All right, John Kim from Rethink Reviews. Check it out on Huffington Post, YouTube, and also rethinkreviews.net. Thanks as always.
Thank you.